Buenas tardes. Hola a
Hello
todos.
and good afternoon, everyone. Welcome to today's webinar, Justicia Restaurativa en Colombia, Restorative Justice in Colombia and the Humanities. So we'll begin with these cultural agents. I'm Steve Levitsky. I'm director of the Rockefeller Center for Latin American Studies, and I'm going to be the moderator today. So first off, I would like to thank the intellectual author of this event, but everyone, Jimena and Gabrielle, Paola, for making this event possible. So the event will be uh, in Spanish, but we have simultaneous interpretation into English. So in order to activate simultaneous interpretation, click on the icon with the world icon on the inferior right part of your screen, and then select your language. And then click on mute original audio. So you can find translation there and then choose the language of your preference. So with the effort of Colombia to create a balance after 60 years of war, the Tribunal of Transitional Justice for Peace is in charge of developing mechanisms and practice to create restorative justice. So the balance between the demands of legality and the viability are really difficult and require sensibility and imagination on behalf of the magistrates and the interlocutors, included the victims, victimaries, and lawyers on both sides. Our webinar explores the notable advances of the GEP in the participation of these human-based strategies for the work of transitional justice. And so in conversation with Magistrate Roberto Vidal Lopez and the initiative of cultural agents of Harvard University. So before I pass the microphone, I have some housekeeping rules. We will be recording this session. It will be available on YouTube channel. And second of all, we hope that you can come in other activities and conferences that we organize here in our chat. Actually, Gabrielle right now is putting different links and also social media channels, so you can follow us there. And we would love for your questions after today's presentation. We have the chat box that is blocked, but right now, if you have any questions, you can go to the Q&A icon on the right-hand side of your screens, and you can ask your questions. We'll tackle those questions at the end of the session, but we can do it, also in the middle of it. So please don't be afraid to ask your questions. And now, without further ado, I will introduce our speakers. It's an honor to have Roberto Carlos Vidal Lopez, Magistrate of the Peace Tribunal for Colombia. Dr. Vidal is professor, researcher at the Pontificia Universidad Javierana. He is professor in law in Colombia, Universidad del Rosario y Pontificio Universidad Javierana. He's been a main professor and director of the History and Law Department and the Social and Cultural Studies of SAT um, of Pontificia Universidad Javierana. So we also, today we have, Dr. Vidal Lopez has associate for forced migration director and the University Network for Peace. He was member of the National Council for Peace and the mediation of and with universities superior colleges. So welcome. It's an honor to have you here, Roberto. We also have other speakers, Marco Abarca Diaz. He's an expert in international law and human rights during the Civil War transition in Central America a couple of years ago. He has a master's in international and human rights studies from Oxford University, and he is an honorary member of the National Ethic Committee. He was for many years professor of the law university in Puerto Rico, and right now he's an independent researcher for human rights. So welcome, Marco. And then last but not least, we have our professor of the Cultural Agents program and professor at the Romance Language and Literature and African and Afro-American Studies at Harvard University, Doris Sommer. So Professor Sommer links academic research with the civic processes through different programs like the wonderful training programs that combine structure with innovation and culture. And she has written a few books, among them Ficciones Fundacionales in América Latina, Abrazos y Rechazos, the other book, Cómo leer en clave menor, bilingual studies, for those that, okay, there's a wordplay there, but in the Cultura Ciudadana and Humanidades Públicas. So thank you so much, Doris, for being here. Welcome. And now let's begin a conversation between Professor Sommer and Professor Ibar. So Vidal. So welcome everyone, and the floor is yours. Thank you so much, Steve. Thank you, Dr. Glass, for this opportunity, this amazing moment for us to actually share with you the wonderful work that NAHEP is doing. They actually know quite a lot within Colombia, but and it's a model for justice at an international level. And that actually, maybe we could talk about that with a question that Marco was saying, maybe that he can ask to Roberto Carlos Vidal. So I would like to start by asking a magistrate about the work of AGEP. What is their mission? What is your practice, Judge, in order for us to get a bit more of an idea of how the JEP is created? So thank you, Judge. The floor is yours. Thank you so much, Doris, and thank you to the Center for Latin American Studies. Steve, thanks for the invite, and Marco, with whom we've been working a lot in this framework, this initiative of working together with HEP. So for us, we are the special jurisdiction for peace, so the Peace Tribunal, and we have three institutions that were created in the negotiation that happened between the old guerrilla FARC, Fuerzas Armadas Revolucionarias de Colombia, and the Colombian government, which ended with an agreement, a peace agreement, actually, that was quite holistic, let's say, that covered a lot of different areas of the social Colombian life. And one of them, a chapter that is dedicated to the victims. And these institutions of this chapter, it's a Truth Commission that is ending its work this year, actually presenting its discoveries and really showing maybe different alternatives of different social work that we could do into the future. So we had as an organism that seeks for missing people, and they're very, very dedicated and precise when finding more than 100,000 people that are missing after these decades of, of fighting. So, and the Special Peace Tribunal, which is a legal judicial entity, which its function is to create a criminal trial of the worst human rights violations and humanitarian international rights during the Colombian conflict. So that happened during it. So we have been here for more than 15 years, and we have 38 judges, and our job in this peace tribunal has to be read as a togetherness of the system that is seeking for the truth, for judicial work, and these institutions work hand in hand. This is like the formal way it should be described. But at the bottom of it, one of the biggest challenges that we have, and that's how I would like to start, is this idea of transitional justice, which means that it's not only about administrating justice or doing a criminal trial, but having as an objective to generate a transition, right? A transformation. And I reckon that in part, that is what the conversation will be about today. What is the reach of that transition? Because where are we transiting towards, right? What is lacking to create that transition? Transition towards peace, transition towards social stability, but also transition towards many other things that have to do with culture and that have to do with many other elements, an array of elements that on top of legal, political, economical, I mean, these are aesthetic, ethical, elements that we need to make sure we have on point. Thank you so much. And with that, I think it leads us to the last point that you actually mentioned, Roberto, by talking about that creative part of transition, right? Because if it's a transition, it's not about, following the law blindly, right? Can you talk a bit more about the flexibility that is needed, or maybe about the way in which this notion of transition has been tackled in practice, and what does transition has to do with restorative justice? What is the relation between those two terms? Okay, let me tell you that in Colombian culture, but also in Colombian history, the way we do develop this history, I mean, we read our past. And let me just say that the movement between peace and war, has a fundamental role because, this historical Colombian narrative that is being shown as a succession of conflicts from the independence to our current days. And it's really rooted in the popular, common citizen kind of history. The idea that Colombia is a violent country and it can be reduced to talking about one conflict after the other. But that wouldn't separate us from the history of any other country. But for us, that interpretation as Colombians is really important. So when we talk about transition, I think this is a very Colombian idea, this idea of interpret of translating social movement of being in war toward and going towards peace, right? But that movement, in the same way, takes us back to war. So, what is our intent at HEP? It's to create a transformation that is pointing towards a difficult reconciliation of the country, right? It's reconciliation that also could have a lot of translations and interpretations because it's not about big consensus but maybe reconciliation in order to have every single antagonisms and confrontations that any contemporary society has, but also by not using weapons, right? The idea that in Colombia we can have politics and that we can have economical conflict, but without using weapons and guns in order to solve these issues. And not only criminal and guns, but the creation of organized groups that use arms in order to have confrontation or social disturbance. So these objective, this main target, which is the objective of our peace tribunal, I mean, it's difficult and is at the base of this transitional justice kind of idea. Among many other initiatives, I mean, if you take at the end of a conflict, after you sign the agreement, you decide to talk about the truth, making a recount of what happened, the truth about the conflict. I mean, there's a bet there, and that could generate some sort of a vision or a revelation for society that would, in a way, her to never repeat its history ever again. So, for those that know history and are not willing to repeat it back, so that would like it will be like a eye opener, right? So, and how do you achieve that? I mean, undoubtedly, it's a mystery, right? Because on one side, that mystery is solved through legal tools and trial and the different procedures, proofs, giving proof. But actually, we know that behind those trials, we need to have something else, something more that will allow us to create a transformation, because it's not only a trial to punish the culpable, right? But to transform society as well. And that has risks involved. Like, for example, going back to an idea that liberalism fought for in order to take away and break away from criminal systems. And so you have this idea about using sentences to give social lessons, and that's complicated. That's actually kind of risky. But what we're trying to do here is to reach languages and ways of introducing these changes. And Doris, I'm sorry, I'm going on and on about this, but this idea of restorative justice comes back again. And this is another proposal that has uh, happened. And in order to make this happen so that we get reconciliation, which is the objective, the fundamental thing we need to do is overcome trial as a dialogue between the state and the one that is being judged. Prosecutors against lawyers and judges that are deciding. And instead of that, it is introducing a new element, which is victims. Victims are there not only as witnesses, but victims are actually actors that have a lot to say, a lot to give to give. Sorry, and this is a very complex area, and it's a really different truth from the truth of the person that is being judged. It's a person that is invited to put their pain on the table in front of everyone, showing what are the things that she or he suffered. And so maybe some power will allow them to get out of this situation of victimization. So as you hear, I mean, these are strong, topics that arise many strong questions about how we can make this as a concrete idea. And this led us to different dialogues with this intuition that it's not enough to have legal tools. It's not enough to have just strictly legal things, but those legal aspects need to have different and diverse connections as well. Thank you for that. And now, while seeking diverse connections, you actually seeks for us, so cultural agents, in order to help to communicate the vision and the achievements of the hymn. So, if you will allow me, I remember how you had thought about a TV series at a moment where, even Facebook broadcasted even on Facebook. And then we said that communication is not a one-way communication, but it has to, have dialogue. And the so-called symbolic reparation only produces symbols on behalf of artists, and then it would be pointless in a way, for victims. So I would like to talk a bit more about that proposal that we developed as a group in order to have a dialogue with the victims in an indirect way, right? Not only about their pain, but also about the achievements and also about the cultural capacities to really tackle uh, fairness and equality with other citizens. So maybe you could talk a bit more about the workshop that we worked on with Marco and everyone, both victims and members of ATEM. Yes, actually, we got together with your team, and you actually invited a few members of our work team. We invited on our side those that work in the HEP, and we work in a very specific area, right? And as you well mentioned, one of the biggest issues is to overcome this idea that is really embedded in the legal, in law, this bilateral conversation, which is necessary. I'm a judge, and the victim is waiting for me to take a decision, and I have to take a decision. But in this transitional process, we also had to introduce a plausible conversational process so that victims could speak the old guerrilla member, that member of the force of the armed forces who committed crimes. I mean, the idea is, how do we speak to these people from our viewpoint? And this is key. Very different power positions and very complex different dynamisms, right? A person that is being seeked and a victim that had terrible damages. Talk about institutionality from the viewpoint of the GEP. So all of that, we put it in context, and we created a dialogue that you actually promoted, and you had methodologies that actually allowed us not to go into the traditional topic about communication of texting people so that they would learn, quote unquote, right? Instead, a possibility of having a conversation that would happen. And that's the way I experienced it. It was like 6 weeks of dialogue, week weekly sessions, entire afternoons, and we did it through Zoom. I mean, we did it electronically, I mean, online, and this is a challenge as well, let me tell you. But what we saw is that those methodologies allowed us to talk to very diverse people with different capitals and political diversity. I mean, I remember the case of an amazing farmer, a beautiful man who you could hear the horse, walking. You could hear like the horse walking in the country. I mean, very diverse connectivities, and I mean, it was amazing. So if we have the online magic, I think these methodologies allow to create a different magic, a magic of a dialogue that would be allowing a language, a single language. And we filled ourselves with humanities, but it actually freed us to talk about a text, which is a text that is at the center of this workshop, in order to reread, re-talk about it, reproduce things, and produce things from a common reading filled with fun things around it. So that was an incredible dynamic. Thank you so much. And I actually remember that moment when we realized that a friend of ours was, riding a horse whilst participating in this talk, so in this workshop. And I remember the time when a farmer girl actually looked for that legal text, and a judge colleague was so anxious because she didn't know that text that she was talking about. And we actually said to her, find a colleague, because yeah, she did it amazingly. It was amazing. I don't know if you remember that moment. That was a moment where everyone got leveled, that power was in a way leveled in that conversation between parties. So yeah, thank you so much for these responses and that invitation to keep on thinking and keep on bringing more and more effort. So now the floor is to Marco Abarca Diaz, who is here with us, and he was a leader of the design of this Edición de Pretextos. So Marco, the floor is yours, and please, you have one question. Oh, I think you're muted, Marco. Yes, yes, we can hear you, Marco. Yes, perfect. Thank you, everyone. And I'm so happy to be a part of this dialogue. Doris, when you asked me to be a part of this panel, I mean, it really excited me because, and I say that because I was a member of this transitional and peace project working for the human rights, groups that were non-governmental, and it had many leaders from all Central America and from other countries. So, for Guatemala, El Salvador, I remember that when we were talking about reconciliation and peace, I mean, the main focus, and I remember this, it was like reconciliation between the state and the guerrilla. That was the main focus, right? And that's where they wanted peace. And it was belligerent, but I don't remember them talking about the victims, right? Never including them maybe as witnesses for judicial processes, but not really included. So in the workshops that we did, I started to think differently, right? Trying to include them in Colombia. And I told Doris, definitely, I want to be a part of this from start to end. I want to know what you're doing. I want to work with you. And something really important from what Roberto just said is that when they were talking about transitioning in Colombia, and they were talking about reconciliation and peace, right? As it's been uh, said before. But they have two intermediate kind of concepts, which are that the process is aiming towards the truth, right? So, for example, if anyone that knew the war issues in Central America or reads the document of the Truth Commission, well, at least, it gives me many feelings, right? And it kind of victimizes people. So it's for me, it's not such a good thing. So for these processes of different Colombian institutions, not international institutions, but Colombian institutions that can give following up the transition. And that's why the structural changes are in order. And thus we can give them this continuance. So Roberto used a concept that is quite interesting to me, which is he talked, and maybe we should talk a bit more about that. The fact that in the framework of this talk, the title says restorative justice in Colombia and the humanities, right? So what's the link between these two? And I think that Roberto did it when he said that this is aiming towards the truth. Humanities, you study the truth, right? But there isn't really like an aspiration of correcting, like this is the truth. That exists in law. It does, right? It exists there. And they create conventional law. But to this discovering the concept of justice and freedom and all of these based on empiric laws in social sciences. So for me, I'm a bit worried, or it worries everyone, that humanities are kind of losing strength in universities and academic centers because it's not about having an aspiration about this is the truth. because 200 deputies raised their hands, so that should be the truth. And the other one, that certain people with specializations that discover empiric truths, and the rest of us that have, like, we can think, all these farmers that were victimized. We also have the aggressors. I mean, they don't specialize in social sciences. How do they reach a truth? How do they get to it? So that is the job of humanities. That, I reckon, should be the need. So I love the effort that they're doing in Colombia about, like, taking a step back, right? In order to, before a judge says this is the sentence, I mean, before that, even to start to discover that vocabulary, the truth of each person or each group. And that is what I would love for Roberto to maybe talk a bit more about, this process of dialogue that you're trying to institutionalize in Colombia, which would be different from the one that has happened in other countries, this transitional model. Marco, it's amazing. Thank you so much for that input. And actually, what you are suggesting is really hardcore, but let me ask the audience something, right? So these type of discussions happen in real time. And real time, and I would like to say this clearly, the peace process in Colombia wasn't really acclaimed or welcomed by the entire population with big, hope. I mean, this is developed within a very, very acute political discussion. The process actually divided society. And as society, I mean, it's not a minority. I think half of the society, and now we know it's been more accepted, but a very important part of the population opposed these, and many that are against the peace tribunal I am part of, and they are against it. So I want to talk about opposition, right? Because what you put on the table about humanities and the debate you're talking about, I mean, this is something that is like the truths that are, at stake. It's not, like a half consensuated kind of truth. And this faces us to the conflict that it's a producer of truth and a producer of opinions, and also a producer of how a country is read or seen, if you're inside or outside the conflict. And I'm not just talking about readings such as FARC, of people with a revolutionary intention, the political destiny of a country seen in a certain way. But I'm talking about every single direction, economically speaking, but also the more capillary, parts of the society. By that, I mean, for example, family matters, more molecular things like masculinity, what's feminine, things like what's local, farmers, readings about nature, because we have readings about nature that comes from literature, for example, or that idea that we created about narcotráfico. So when you talk about this place of the truths of that place where humanity should be focused on, I think it's a place that it's not bucolic. It's not just simply saying, okay, it's like an intellectual exercise, but also a daily exercise of people that are producing and reproducing their realities and interpreting their realities, and settling into it. And for us, it's been a conflict in a very process towards peace that's been conflictive. So for truth, I would say it's difficult to tackle that word because we are, fighting them with our bodies, and that's the scenario that we've been seeing. And it suggests what you've been mentioning, Marco. Thank you. And in the workshops that we had, I loved interaction moment between the victims and people from the special jurisdiction for peace. And I thought to myself, this is like a futuristic event, right? Because when they were having this dialogue and talking about what is a sanction or which should be the types of sanctions, when they talked about the word of reconciliation, but they talked about pardon. And so we sat in small groups during the workshops with 5 people, 3 victims, um, a person that was the from the JEP. It was me as well in the group, and between the victims, they talked about pardon, and 3 people with 3 different viewpoints, and I loved seeing that. I loved that in 20 minutes they were like, okay, the pardon that I can give as a person is different from the pardon that I can give as a member, as a collective of victims, because I can understand my personal viewpoint and no one's going to force me to forgive the others. But I understand that need to do transitions or compromise, right? In order to talk about certain types of pardon, quote unquote, in order to advance in this reconciliation process. And I also loved how the person participated in this workshop, the person from HIP, he said, the pardons is a personal, and we're not going to pass judgment on that, right? I mean, these processes of pass and reconciliation, everyone's entitled to their own personal, ideas, but you can have a main common objective, which is reconciliation. Now, I think, and I just want to, give a different turn to the same question, right? So in order to solve this from any jurisdiction or normal, like a normal tribunal, when the objective is reconciliation, sometimes it's impossible because you have people that are winners and those that have been conquered in a way or vanquished. So there's going to be a character that maybe you are the one that during the sanction, but it's really complicated to tell someone, to be just judge and also to be a party. And the fact that they created a special tribunal, I mean, for me, I think that was necessary, and it was an optimal kind of thing, and it hasn't been done in other countries, even in Central America, not the way you are doing it in Colombia. So the fact that you chose to develop a consultation kind of forum with the victims, I think that process is necessary and should be encouraged. Now, there is one point where it stops being merely legal, and that's the moment where you take it to the ethical kind of field, which is the judge has to decide about, I mean, as we said, forgiveness, no, but the judge has to decide about the minimum law requirements and to aspire when we talk about pacification or reconciliation to a maximum strata. But if you just stayed in the minimum law requirements, then you won't have pacification or reconciliation or real reconciliation. And that's where, before the trials, we need to have these types of dialogues. How they develop this scheme of dialogues? How have you been developing that? Well, actually, that's been one of the most interesting conclusions of the exercise we did with these workshops, because we started to see that these dialogues that the project, or maybe the dialogue that we are trying to build upon, has to precede judicial action. For example, if I go to an audience and I'm fully dressed as a judge, very formalized in an environment such the way it should be, right? A judicial environment with all the hierarchies and all the competences that I have in order to take decisions, right? But if I get there and people are simply submitted to the rule of law, then maybe we don't have possible dialogue. And then what I'm doing is amplifying my voice as a judge, but never allowing that interaction. So when you go to the exercise, we reach the conclusion that maybe it's necessary to activate dialogues and interventions that would preparate people or get them ready in order to see something that for them would be unthinkable. For example, a sentence is not engineering, right? It's a decision about the responsibility of a person, and it's a decision that it has that will have an effect on this person's life, black and white. But there's this pretension that maybe you can amplify that effect. And that's where dialogue is clear, and dialogue is really difficult too. And if you will allow me, you were talking about victims, right? And this is a learning that we've learned as judges, and it's fascinating because when we receive testimonies from victims, but also us acknowledging those that were the aggressors, but today are subject to the law. So I go back to that topic that you were saying about humanities and how different textures are created in order to have a conversation. So when we started to hear the victims out, and actually I was working and that we had a case, the case number one of REP was about a kidnapping policy. During 10 years, they gave out the order to kidnap civilians, and they are accused for crime against the humankind. So 23,000 kidnappings during those time, 300 kidnappings a day at a point. So we're talking about a very scary volume, right, of kidnapping. And I'm echoing this. This is something we can count, right? You can rebuild the model and the ancient FARC model about how all this used to work. But we reached another point where Julieta Lemaitre, my colleague, and I, she's a relator of this case, and she did a beautiful work in the way she wrote about this, about how victims were actually narrating. I can talk about quantitative terms, right? In structural terms, it's terrible to talk about it, but the most difficult thing is to get to this nuclear kind of moment, capillary moment, where they're talking about their experience whilst being kidnapped. So, for example, the pain, right? And I'm just going to put it on the table, the moral pain. For example, military members, their biggest offenses they had was that installation where they were locked in was next to a place where they're keeping pigs, right? Or hogs. So when they fed them, they saw that they fed the hogs more than they fed them. So that for them was the biggest offense, right? That moral thing of being compared to an animal, to a farm animal. I mean, that was one of the things that offended the most these men. And maybe for the law, for the law, it was like the least of the things, right? Like for them, it was like, it doesn't matter. But for those, we're talking about moral, we're talking about the aesthetics, the image of them being submerged in this very strong image and the big offense behind it. So I just wanted to give you a concrete example, because when you start talking with the victims, then you see dimensions, different dimensions of what it means to be offended, or these, legally, these things sometimes they slip under and we don't grasp the thing, where evil is in places where you don't easily see it coming. So yeah. Okay, I'm gonna do an intervention here, because when I heard you two talking, uh, I would love to hear more about you, but I see some interesting questions here. So I would like to invite Steve Levitsky. Professor, could you, if you want, you can ask a question if you have one. Yes, of course. And then we can go to the Q&A session. Like, I would like to talk about what Roberto was mentioning about this division in the Colombian society, right? And the fact that there wasn't social consensus, right? They were all there. So, and in the last few years, you've been working with a government that rejects, almost entirely the process. So I would like to ask you concretely, specifically, what impression do you have, and how has it been to work under a government uh, which program has nothing to do with restorative justice? They're not really interested in restorative justice, really, as the way you perceive it, and neither nor the pain of the victims. So how has been how have you tackled this with the government? Thank you, Stephen. And let me tell you that this has been a very difficult situation for us in the jurisdiction, but for them also in government. Let me tell you why. Because we are in opposite sides, but with legal obligations that are common, right? So let's say that opposition to the agreement is not under the table. I mean, it was their government program, right? But they were faced with obligations that are written in the constitution, in the law. So I would like to ask them, what they have done it against their political will or their personal conviction, and the government has in a way complied with some obligations, right, under difficult situations, which is being in a structural disagreement with all of this. But in this difficult situation, the conclusion that we could have is that we have a new electoral process where this situation, and I'm going to use the conventional term of the peace program and the negotiations with the FARC, have become a state kind of policy, quote unquote, in the sense that they're really well welded within the constitutional regime and the legal regime. And they have become a political program that, even for an opposition program, they cannot ditch it. So they have to stick to it. And this has created for the execution and the advancements to have a very complex rhythm, a difficult rhythm. But even though all of this happens, we've been able to move forward with our program. And actually, this is a merit, right? That even though that they are in a position of antagonism and opposition to the existence of this peace tribunal that was, shown in public strategies for the government. I mean, the government has been really respectful of the system, right? And the judicial system that we live in. And we've been able to move forward and to work with restrictions. Yes, they're more politicized, but our space has been respected. And, and with that, I would say, okay, how does the peace process is? That would be the question. But one of the main pointers that show the success of this Colombian process is that they're freeing themselves from these peace accords, and many analysts are saying this, that we are reaching a political campaign, maybe the first time ever, when the central political discussion is not about peace. Is not about peace. Every single previous political campaign was turning around war and peace and war and peace. But this is the first one where we look like any other contemporary society. We're talking about COVID, about poverty. We're talking about the left and the right. We're polarized. I mean, this is the first time that we are sharing this with important possibilities of having presidency as left, but also with right-winged programs with possibilities. I mean, we're starting to look like any old, contemporary society. And I think that's a big, big success for the Peace Tribunal and for peace itself. Thank you. Thank you for that. And we've been receiving a couple more questions, so I'm going to read out 2 questions. They ask for a bit more depth, maybe about other concepts, so feel free to answer. The first one is encounters and workshops. Were there moments where there was a discussion about um, the other one has to do with dialogue. So, what do you understand by dialogue, and which are the most difficult borders or barriers to break down when we're doing this type of dialogue? Okay, I would ask Doris and Marco to come here and tell us. Yes, yes, honestly, because I would say yes. I found that victim, I mean, events such as what Marco mentioned, victims affirming their condition as victims and explaining what does it mean to be a victim and their position, because right now we're talking about a region that is really really complicated. Sumapaz in Colombia, for those that know the country well, that is like a region that traditionally was occupied and controlled by the old FARC guerrilla. And although it's still part of the capital of Bogota, of the territory, I mean, it's part of the capital, it's almost inaccessible, geographically speaking, with populations that are in extreme poverty and that they have suffered, a lot from the conflict, from the armed conflict. So we're talking about people, the Somapas, that have suffered immense damages. But I would maybe send the ball right to our colleagues. I mean, how did you see this? Okay, I would like to follow on this. And I just wanted to remind you of an important point that Roberto mentioned previously, which is dialogues are important as preparation, right, for sentencing. Why? Because a victimized person that is then able or has a possibility of talking of, or to talk with decision makers, official decision makers, then they're not victims anymore. And in certain sense, in a certain way, I mean, not in the sense we're talking here about previously to the sentence, right? Prior to the sentence, we're talking about, we're suggesting of an activity of those that command and those that suffer. But those that suffer, the victims, they are proposing things and become facilitators for everyone, and they become less victims. They have a voice, they've been heard, and then and thus they have been taken into account into their leadership. And in even in that very humble environments, like for example a reading writing workshop. So I mean, it's not a confrontation, and that is something I want to highlight, right, Roberto, because confrontations follow war patterns, but dialogue dialogue to create interpretation and to hear different viewpoints, to go back to thinking about what does pardon means. And I think that's exactly where we start to plant the seed, right? This seed where victims have a voice, and that is just creating a bridge to the non-victimization or future non-victimization. So this is what I wanted to say about dialogue. It's not confrontation. Marco, sorry, Doris, but I remember that one of the first interventions that I did in this Pretextos workshop, and I had to coordinate the dialogue that day. And I started by asking, what do you think about the text that we've just read? And then you said to me, well, in this methodology, this is not the question that we are asking, is what are you going to do with it? I mean, what's going to result as a, as a result of it? And this is the idea of transitional justice and what you're finding in the way. The idea is not what you think about the conflict and who was the bad guy and who was the good guy, but what are we going to do now? That is the main thing. And what can you create afterwards? And that was something that really, you made a big impression that day. Thank you, Doris. Now, what Roberto is saying is so true in the sense that we have to consider dialogical ethic. Maybe we are appealing to something beyond the law. This this ontological ethic is based in the critical hermeneutics, and these have to do with the fact that, for example, if we're going to define democracy, because we know that the Occidental viewpoint existed, but for us, democratic was the Occidental. I mean, we can't define democracy, but not of the concept of democracy, but we're going to work on the how and not so much about the what, right? So what I mean by all of this is that we did a formal exercise of democracy. That was what we did in the workshop, right? And as Doris well said it, they're not victims because they spoke, right? And anyone who can speak should speak, has to speak. Those are the rules. If I'm going to be complaining afterwards and I didn't speak, I rather just stayed silent, because if you can speak, you should speak. So in a workshop that we did in Bahamas with people that have, and they had to answer, different questions to know. It was a workshop in Bahamas about statelessness, right? To know if they felt from, Haiti or from where. So at the end of the day, they created their own judicial concept about what it means, right? So basically, from what they were saying, they have to take a decision. So they thought as judges, right? So basically, as researchers, we work more in formal democracy than substantive democracy. I think that's ideal for this deconstruction of democracy kind of processes. So that's where the option of defining dialogue as such, as a formal dialogue. If you allow me, Marco, to react to what you just said, let me just say that as a Colombian as a Colombian, I was raised in my house. There was a sign in our living room. My dad actually hung it there, and it was a classic one that said, forbidden. You cannot speak about religion or sex or different things, so that we could eat, right? And he hung it in the living room because we were having so many fights as a family. So one of the things that conflict leads to is dialogue. Conflict installs in an enormous social silence, like an instruction. There's a common calladito más bonito, which means you're prettier when you are silent, right? Like that kind of things, those kind of things that are rooted in our culture. In a country where we have amazing speakers, Colombia became a very silent place and filled with fear. So I think that that's why these different tools of going back into dialogue are fundamental to think about this notion of transition. So yes, thank you. Okay, you're muted. Steve, I don't know if you have one more question, or should I ask a question myself? Okay, you can ask a question. Roberto, let me ask you a first question. It's just to link to this installed piece from above, right? And like the idea that the JEP is there to forgive the aggressors. So I would like first off to retake that question and actually ask it in a way that we could talk about the measures that HEP uses to decentralize in a creative, constructive way, the way that you are developing them, but to take accountability towards the aggressors. They need to be accountable, right, of this violence. So how are you doing that? Okay, let me go back to this idea of silence, right? These processes, they've been really recurrent in Colombia previously to these two. I'm talking about those that already have justice elements, processes with the paramilitaries and the FARC. These trials actually led us to the forgiveness. And Marco knows about these, right? And the forgiveness, maybe the mirror that we have, and due to the different cultural connections and colonial, it's the forgiveness and the way we were forgotten, right, by the Spaniards, these conflicts that go way past, right? But there were different sectors in this case that defended this idea of forgetting about it, forgiving and forgetting. That was our main thing, right? So here ordinary justice was always able to judge the things that went into conflict, but they didn't have enough tools to do so. And undoubtedly we are inheritors of thousands and thousands of really brave judges that did amazing work, but they were persecuted for it, murdered, and this created an impunity framework that is immense. So this peace tribunal is created with special tools to enable us to speak about the conflict and to enable research and enable the truth. And that has different conditions in order to work. So first off, the idea of selecting, right? A difficult selection. We talk about prioritization, right? Giving priority to the most serious cases. And this will always be controversial because it's a capacity of just where we're all only able to take the biggest cases, and we're getting there. But the second tool is that this is a reconciliation process, in the sense that those that were the aggressors, the objective is not only revenge, because that's in the heart of everyone, right? Revenge. That's the main fundamental, to do revenge against someone who, put pain on that. And that we have it in our conviction, or on our moral conviction, each and every single one of us. But transitional flexibility. But how do you get this flexibility? First off, for victims to get prioritization about getting the truth, because for me, in ordinary justice, it's happened to have a person, that is just defending his supposed innocence. So that's it, right? Nothing else can be proven. So I'll answer back to that. So that doesn't really help the victims, because what the victim is interested in is to know what happened, know the truth. We are dedicated to victims that have asked us to, I want for the accused to tell me why they kidnap me. The women that were fighting from this, I want to know why. I want to know that my son wasn't a fighter, that kind of thing, when mothers were in trials with their sons being parts of this FARC. So the defendant is just defending himself in a way. So this is what it provokes, to give conditions to this plaintiff, right? To give a talk into the truth, but to give stimuli so that there is acknowledgement of responsibility. And that is happening today in the GEP, because basically we're waiting on the 30th. The FARC is going to manifest on their acknowledgement for the kidnapping subject. And so it's the same thing with the other cases. And the other topic is sanctions, right? And that's what we talked about during the workshop. So a part of this workshop, and as Doris well said, we need to explain this to the society, how this works. And the sanctions ended up being like, it's a reduced sentence through time. They reduced sentence time, and people don't go to prison, but it's 8 years where the condemned or those that have been made responsible need to create projects to contribute to the reparation for the victims. It's not the person that we send, like we say in Colombia, to rot in a prison, as we say, but we take them out of prison and we make them work for the victims for a certain period of time. And that has an ethical, very strong kind of idea behind it. And so that scheme that we implemented, I think that is completely opposite to what we're saying, because we are trying to see the situation of the conflict in detail. And I actually reckon that what we saw in the first documents that the jurisdiction produced was enormous reactions throughout the country. And that's fascinating to us to see, because that shows us that this work makes sense, right? And it gives us, a sense, and it really shakes society, because we think about in the GEP that our challenge is to have a peace tribunal that will shake society and wake it up. And this is not easy. And I would like to say that before us, there was special trials for paramilitary, uh, and society, disappeared. Like, they were doing amazing, they're amazing jurists, but when they publish their sentences, they don't even produce a media kind of, uh, you know that could erase a total and complete. The GP has managed to put itself in the middle of the dialogue, and I think it's completely opposite to impunity, because when we end these accusations, they have produced reactions in graffitis. For example, this week we have a topic in schools are talking about that, and a debate on institutions, on schools. I mean, there is a possibility to shake society with what we do, and this is completely different to impunity. Thank you so much. And I have one more question before we pass the microphone to Steve. So I think that we could follow up on what Roberto just said. So I'm going to put two questions in one, right? Are there institutions, like, for example, museums or memorials that work for the HIP? And the other question would be, does the GEP has educational, like pedagogic kind of vision to promote its vision? So do you have that, like a teaching kind of approach? Yes, actually, we've been lucky, uh, because we worked hand in hand with the Truth Commission, La Comisión de la Verdad. They did an amazing cultural work with material production, language exploration, territorial expression, which has been amazing. And we've been working hand in hand with them, and hopefully we'll inherit that work, because more for the merit of the Comisión de la Verdad than from our merit, because we've been more focused on the legal aspects. But the next thing is that I'm in charge at GEP of creating a participation commission where everyone, when we meet weekly, to really design and think about it. Because, and this is super interesting, listen out, because in a normal tribunal, the judge is always, following up their decisions. And in a transitional jurisdiction, we need to work with teachings, pedagogy, participation. We have to see security. We have to look for how to communicate these ideas, because it's not only reading out, decision right in front of the press and that's it, just giving out a sentence. No, this is a follow up, a very thorough one. And the it has a series of new different things that we've been learning, and it's a process, and that's what we are trying to do together, right, by helping each other with projects such as these. So hopefully we'll keep developing pretexts to talk about this new citizenship that will sustain peace. So thank you. I trust, yeah, I have trust in that as well. Thank you. Okay, so first off, which are the different strategies that have been contemplated to restore the rights of those that have been victimized, right? And another question that's completely different but really interesting as well: when will this process culminate? I mean, it's very healthy and very useful, but it doesn't really end, right? So how do you know when this is over? Okay, fascinating. And let's start with that because this has a formal ending. The GEP is only for 15 years, 1 5. And basically, we can take 5 more just to make sure that the rulings are taken into account. But we're temporary. We are, and that makes a lot of sense. But when you say 15 times in human years, it's a lot of time. But in legal time, it's a blip. So basically, a theft of a mobile phone, the trial is 5 years, more or less, for a mobile phone that has been stolen. So imagine a trial such as this is going to take us 15 years. So if it gives us 15 years, it's like 2 or 3 trials only that we can do. So that is limited, and this is a constant worry we have, that we don't have enough time. The second thing is gender related. It's very important from the way it is rooted, and it's interesting to share it because one of the elements of the jurisdiction is integration, because we don't come from ordinary integrating processes of the judicial part, because that has a long career, but from high tribunals in Colombia that involves the choosing of political parties. So we were chosen as a tribunal that created national and internationally, so both, right? Inter-American, European human rights, the Supreme Court in Colombian, and the university system. And this created an integration in the tribunal that is very different to the very high courts in the country. So given that, it's worth mentioning that we are a tribunal that we have only 5 members of the 38, 6 members that are indigenous and Afro-descendant, right? Afro-Colombian, and thus has no precedence in the high courts in Colombia. But in terms of gender, this is a tribunal that 60% of their participants are legal, are women lawyers. And this has a lot to do with integration, right? The fact that the first thing that they did in the GEP 15 days after was to create a gender commission, where most of our colleagues were there creating it and reinforcing it. And when we talk about gender and the fact that this leads us to activism that women have done in Colombia, because to have sexual violence crimes visible. And we have research that has started regarding the debates of possibly having cases that will give way to sexual violence crimes. And also, gender is always very present in our work and in the work of GEP. So this is a key topic for everyone, and it's a very interesting precedent about how confirmation has you know has a toll on decisions and decision making. Doris? Okay, I have a couple questions here that I would like to read about humanities. And actually, the question here is talking about an observation from Marco Abarca, where he mentioned what is truth. And the question is, does the evolution of thinking through humanities would give us a cognitive process? Hang on, I'm going to find the question. Does that it goes hand in hand with a literary tradition in Colombia, and with this literary culture, does it help to promote the type of dialogue that you described, Marco, in your input? And Roberto, meanwhile, maybe you could think about answering or giving us some last comments, because we'll be closing this session. So yeah, so maybe start thinking about your closing arguments. Thank you. And Marco, the floor is yours. Okay. I like the question in the sense that you are showing, believing you have the truth. And it was mentioned about, how the law can, but also social sciences that can correct that. Because when you say, or when the person that asks says, cognitive aspects that are being developed, knowledge together with education, and the way you asked your question, I mean that's exactly what we've been trying to say, right? That judicial context, supposedly it's the truth because it's the law. It needs to be taken by people that are interested, neighbors, aggressors, victims. Anyone can take that and rebuild their interpretation of those texts, right? That's the idea. So these pre-trial antellations and kind of things that we are working on. And when I said that humanities had a special role with it, I said it because no one is very technic in psychology or statistics. No one's an expert, and nor legal experts, right? But if my dad or my mom or my neighbor, we don't understand the concept of truth that they are saying, why that humanities are saying, so why are they called humanities if they can't understand it? So that's where I send the ball back to you. The comment is mine, but you are saying it's to take humanities where they are needed, not only in the classrooms but in the peace processes in Colombia, for the aggressor and the victim and whoever is present in this construction of a truth or of a reconciliation process can understand it. And that's what I said about cognitive processes and the acknowledgement. Thank you so much, Marco. And humanities, yes. And from that, we'll keep cooking and we'll keep publishing, because humanities have still a lot of space for different viewpoints. We still have room for that. And at the end of the day, we need to reach conclusions, but we need to admire even a fellow countryman, so we can that would rise to the occasion of everyone. So Roberto, I don't know if you want to share with us some last final comments, or Steve, I don't know if you have also some final or a last question or comment. No, I want to hear what Roberto has to say, and then I'll give my closure. Yeah, thank you. Me too, actually. Thank you. Okay, first off, I would like to thank you for having this dialogue. It's been amazing, and doing this exercise, right? This was crucial for everyone here present. And I would like to share also this enormous expectation we have at the GEP and in the country for the possibilities of having a transition due to this peace tribunal. Because when we talk about transitional justice, people think that transition is behind us, right? So there was a peace pact, and so we reached peace. So now we have a no, but we've learned that transition is before us, right? In the future. Peace is in front of us. And you cannot actually create these peace tribunals in countries that are peaceful, where everyone's talking. And no, we need to do a lot of things to really promote it, to promote dialogue. And it's clear for us that it's not exclusively our duty, right, for the peace tribunal. It's a duty for the society as well. That's why we have to go into bigger dialogues. And we know that this is not going to be solved in the legal. This is just a, a, a a bit of sand, right? But these are processes that are much larger. And I go back to humanities, right? Of course, there are structural things behind it. A society that has to be more democratic, more participative, right? Yes, of course. But also a society that has to have the possibility to be interpreted differently, to be read differently, to use new languages, to use new resources among the creative ones. And really, Marco just reminded me of Gabriel Garcia Marquez. In the 50s, he wrote a text that is called Periodismo y Revolución, where Marquez says he was talking about the Atlantic coast, where he was talking about violence in the news. And to that group of journalists, the owners of the media actually censored them because they were implicated in the violence themselves. And how Garcia Marquez says that when that happens, they close the doors of journalism, they move towards fiction, right? That's their way out. So they say, okay, I'm going to go and write books and novels because fiction opens up a place to say things that you cannot say otherwise. And of course, I want to give homage to Garcia Marquez, that for me, he's a fundamental figure. But what I want to show is that this is like linking it to other languages, and he had the genius to do it, right? But to slide into these other languages to talk about what you cannot talk about. And this is a challenge we're facing and that law is facing as well. So with that, I would like to close and thank you for the space in order to give my talk. Thank you. Oh, sorry, I just want to do a small footnote about what he said, Garcia Marquez, because Roberto said previously that Colombia is a country of great narrators and speakers. So here is one of us right in front of us, right? So with the fact that, not only as a jurist, but a dialogue maker. So I appreciate so much the visit. And I just want to say a last question there was, can you actually, okay, a participant actually, and no one's left the room, but someone asked to re-listen to this talk. So, that's just a note just to close the session and thanking everyone. So thank you, everyone. So that's why we recorded it, Doris. Yeah, you can watch it as many times as you want. Yeah, okay. So we have to close the panel. I'm sorry for those questions that weren't answered because, as you know, time is a tyrant, so we weren't able to answer those. But I would like to thank Roberto Carlos, um, the magistrate, and all our speakers, all the patients, a lot of effort, a lot of creativity, Marco Abarca, Diaz, and everyone in this, it's one of the most difficult transitions in our times. So thank you so much for your input and good luck. Thank you, Steve. Thank you, everyone.